Hello and welcome to All of the Above. I'm James Brown. Thanks for joining me. Check out my work at jamesbrowntv.substack.com. And of course, like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the show. One of my goals for this program is to meet people who do unique things for a living and figure out how and why they get there. When I learned about when I learned about Howard Polskin's work, I knew he fit that bill. Howard runs the writing.com. That's a website aimed at explaining right-wing media perspectives to everybody else. Howard Polskin, welcome to the program.
Well, glad to be here, James.
Did I quite explain what your intentions are with the writing?
I think that was great. Yeah, you deserve a raise in December.
Well, did right-wing media find you or did you find it?
Good question. Like many people, on that fateful November day in 2016, the night after the election, I woke up and I thought, how did we get to this place? How did America elect Donald J. Trump as president? Because I thought I was a smart guy. I read the New York Times. I watch the NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. I watch PBS NewsHour. I read Time Magazine. I read the Wall Street Journal. And somehow I missed it. I knew he was appealing to a small segment of the population, but not the numbers that would elect him president. And so I started looking at right-wing media and for the answers. And I went to websites I'd never been to before. I had never been to foxnews.com, for instance. I'd never been to the National Review's website. And those are somewhat more reasonable conservative ones. But then I started going deeper into places like the Gateway Pundit, WND, and it really blew my hair back. And I thought, wow, like I wish someone could just go to these places every day and send me the links to the more interesting stories so I don't have to hunt for them every morning. And no one was doing it. And I was like, well, I guess that's my job now. So that's how it started.
What were you doing on election night that year? Were you a reporter? Were you a journalist? Were you a
No,
researcher?
I was a civilian, an engaged civilian. You know, I'd followed it pretty closely. Um, and I'm not a political scientist. I have no Washington legislative experience or anything like that, but just someone who's up on current events and concerned about what's happening in the world. Um, so I, but watching that night, of course, I was completely engaged, and I started talking to my best friend who's a former senior editor at Newsweek. This is about 8 o'clock at night. And he kept saying, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. It's like because I'm freaking out. I think Iowa came in and it was Trump. Like the first few results were all Trump. And this is all about 8 o'clock at night, 8:15. And then I think closer to 9, Florida came in and Florida went for Trump. And that's when I was like, oh my God, we're in trouble. And, I'm calling my sisters, I'm calling all my friends, and we're kind of watching in horror. And that's how the night unfolded. And when I woke up the next morning, it was like there was a death in the family. That's how upset I was.
A death in the family.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
How long did that linger?
I mean, a long time because I thought, like, when did the adults step in and say, no, 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 that election didn't count? Like, it was like this cannot be. How did this happen? It was like the earth changed the direction that it was spinning. It's like the ground shifted under my feet. So of course, things that scare us and everything like that. The best way to confront those fears is to try and gather as much information as possible about the subject that's making me, uncomfortable and fearful.
So you start to research it, you start to find these links and go on WorldNet Daily, which I'll bring up later. When did you decide that I need to write a blog? And when did
I
the blog go up?
start- I started, I would say, a turning point was right after it was his. Well, first of all, I marched on the day that he was inaugurated, or that weekend. I marched in New York City, with thousands and thousands of other demonstrators peacefully, um, and I was on the sideline. I was looking at all these sites, um, and then he had been in, his. If you remember Sean Spicer's first press conference where he denied that he lied about the number of attendees at Trump's inauguration right off the bat. Bingo. First, Trump's in office just a few hours, and the lies start right away. And then a few weeks later, that's when Kellyanne Conway said her famous alternative facts. Those aren't lies; those are alternative facts. And then I was like, what world are we living in? And sometime in the middle of February, Trump had his famous comment, or infamous comment, "The press is the enemy of the people," and that really upset me deeply. I am on the board of advisors for the Newhouse School of Communications at Syracuse University, so I'm a professional journalist. I've been in the media business my entire life, and saying that just put me over the edge, and that's when I thought I have to get a little more serious on this, and I started on a daily basis creating a Word document, just grabbing the headlines from these sites that I was visiting, just so I could see the patterns. And it would take me like 45 minutes a day, and I would say right after Charlottesville, I decided that I needed to launch right after Labor Day, and I would, you know, that's when I put pedal to the metal, and I had a launch date and came up with a marketing plan. And when I launched in uh, mid September, it was CNN wrote me up in the Reliable Sources newsletter, and that's how I started getting my first subscribers, and it went from there.
So you're an advisor at Newhouse. What kind of roles in journalism did you have? Or what kind of jobs at that period did you have?
Well, just generally, so my career has been somewhat bifurcated. So the first half
Same
of my
here.
so the first half of my career, I was a I was reporter and staff writer. I had started off at a local weekly newspaper. I came to New York, worked for a trade magazine, and eventually became a staff writer for TV Guide magazine when it had a paid circulation of 17 million a week. And I wrote a lot about television news. So and when I left TV Guide, I joined Turner Broadcasting as a vice president of public relations. The first the first year I was on the entertainment side, but after that I spent the bulk of my career there, heading up CNN's New York public relations office.
So,
And then
great
and then
credentials.
Yeah, and so I, got into public relations, worked for Sony after that, for the trade association for the magazine industry, including a lot of work with the American Society of Magazine Editors. And then I eventually did my own public relations and marketing consulting, um, and then uh, transitioned to this newsletter in 2017.
I've worked in and around journalism for about 15 years.
Hmm.
I personally did not feel the gut punch that I know a lot of journalists and people with journalism experience felt when Trump made that statement about, media being the enemy of the people. What about that was so striking to you?
Well, it's like listen. The press isn't perfect. I get that. You know, there's probably I would imagine there's some liberal bias. Certainly, a lot of reporters that I've come across. I completely understand that, but it's the when the planes hit the Twin Towers in New York, you go to the newspaper to make sense of it. When the condo collapsed in Surfside, Florida, you go if you're a South Florida resident, you go to the Miami Herald. They're going the Gateway pundit isn't going to tell you what happened and some of the problems there and the challenges they were going to face. So it was, offensive to me because and also as someone involved in the Newhouse program, it was like, if Trump is right, if you buy what he's saying and you buy into like fake news, it's like, then you're saying like, well, that must mean that they teach journalists to be propagandists or to outright lie. And as if you worked in a newsroom or any kind of news organization, you know, you got to be right. It's the truth. The truth is what it's all about. So that was so offensive. Now I also understand that I thought, and maybe this was naive, that truth was absolute in certain things. Now in certain things it is like the Earth is round. I
Depends
would
who you ask.
yeah. Now you could you
Yeah.
could say prior to satellite
Right.
planes in the skies or satellites, like without that photographic proof that you
Mhm.
would that that you might be a denier. That
Mhm.
wouldn't be me. Um, but I also have come to realize that there are different ways to look at things. So the advantage of working on the writing is it's exposed me to ideas and thinking that I had a knee jerk reaction like that's garbage, and I still know now from you know colleagues of mine and people I know that they automatically assume that anything coming from the right is wrong and and filled with errors, and that's not necessarily so. So doing the work that I'm doing, it's moved me a little. It's moved me more to the center, um, but not to the right. So that's but it's made me a better listener. I would say I definitely try to listen more to the other point of view.
Yeah, there are a couple of things in your statement that I'd love to pick apart, and that I I think there is an assumption, and it may be a correct one, that every right-leaning publication is not manned by trained journalists or not making a full effort, that they are, like I mentioned, you mentioned flat earth, and like there's a corner of the internet where people are like, yeah, like flat earth, the earth is flat, they're convinced of this. That it seems like when you look at news from one perspective, and you kind of look in the other corner, the corner that you don't travel in, you assume that they're all the extreme of whatever your thought is. I guess I take that as a preamble to ask you, who surprised you when you actually started to consume that info? Were there things that you that were a preconception of yours that you're like, oh, that's interesting. Like I hadn't thought of it that way. What were the surprises for you?
Wow, that's a good question. No one's ever asked me that. I would say how uh, that so many of the websites that I'm on, and I must look at 30 to 40 right wing websites a day. Um, that most of them, but not all, are professionally written. Um, Very few typos, grammatical errors. I mean, there are people who have skills in content creation and journalism and graphic arts. And certainly almost all of them look better than the writing, which is a very simple website that was created 5.5 years ago and desperately needs an upgrade. Um, but so that was a surprise. I I was, some surprised me in a very visceral, negative way. Like, what is that? Like that's that is so wrong. That is so hateful. And I've seen pretty stark examples of racism and homophobia. I certainly see that, and that always hits me like a slap in the cheek. And it's like, how someone put their name in that and they're going out there and they're saying that. Um, but I also think that sometimes I read stuff and it's well measured, and and sometimes I'm surprised because there may be um, opinion pieces that are anti-Trump. And that always kind of surprises me. But on the other hand, it shouldn't, because yes, there are those on the right who are anti-Trump. And then there's it's the right wing media it's not monolithic thinking. It's like they're all not thinking the exact same thing. I was also one last thing. The other thing that surprised me was how the right wing websites far outnumber progressive websites
Mm.
by probably a margin of 5 to 1. And I have considered doing a companion newsletter called The Lefting, meaning I would look at progressive media and aggregate stories from progressive media and then push it to my audience. And I did a test run of that for about 2 weeks, and the problem was that there's just not a lot of. First of all, there's not a lot of media sources like that, and secondly, it's a lot of it is following what the New York Times may be running, or the Washington Post. It's very much in lockstep with that. Not that I'm calling them progressive, but to me that's mainstream. But for those right wing media thinks mainstream media is progressive, and that's probably my final surprise. That what I consider mainstream, those professionals in right wing media think mainstream media is progressive media.
Howard, you're reading my mind here.
Why?
And my prepared questions for you, that was the direction I'm going.
I'm sorry, I
So
didn't mean
let's
to
start.
step on your lines.
No worries. Let's just
My
go
job
there.
isn't my job to make you smart. I think that's my job.
Well, okay, I'll start with you, and then I'll go into the tranche that you're covering.
Okay.
How do you define mainstream media?
Wow, that's good. Uh, no one's asked me that, I, and I kind of struggle to answer that. I think just the traditional definition would be media that's impartial, that doesn't that looks at both sides of the issues and tries to present the information in a fair and unbiased manner. Now, I think when you get into MAGA world and the world that we've been living the last 7 years, so when mainstream media outlets say, that Trump lost the election, and that Trump lies, well, right wing, those on the right think like, no, that is pushing the progressive agenda. So that's the problem we're in. It's like there is no universal truth anymore. And that's an enormous problem.
Was there ever universal truth?
Uh, well, I may sound naive, but I would say generally yes. That we didn't, it's like we always had um, the some of the pillars of American journalism to stand on to help shape our worldview for American citizens. And we had a very vibrant press. And think back 20 years ago, where the three broadcast networks were, cast a huge influence over the country. Cable news networks were ascending. The newspaper industry had a dominant grip on local markets and nationally, and they were reliable. They were a trusted source of news. Radio was a powerful force. So book publishing. So and it was all pretty. Everyone counted on it. Everyone relied on it, and most people were drinking from the same information source. Yes, there might have been some dark alleys. It's in the information flow, but the vast majority of Americans were getting their news from the same mainstream sources. Those days don't exist anymore, and it's broken down into very disturbing ways.
You
It
mentioned
used to be
earlier.
you could stop a conversation, just say like, "No, the New York Times said that." But now if you say that, you might be dismissed by someone on the right. They'd go, "Oh, that's fake news. I don't trust the New York Times."
Well, before I proceed, that's an interesting thought there. I I tend to think the inverse is happening as well. And I think the equivalent of the Times is probably Fox News. That if you had a conservative person or a right wing person say something and they cite Fox, that people on the left and progressive and sort of like democratic voters broadly would be like dismissive of that as well, I would think. What do you think about that?
I think that's a fair point. I will say, however, as someone who reads right-wing media every day for a few hours in the morning, there is there's a lot of citing sources from the New York Times in right-wing media. So
Fascinating.
it's like, wow, they're like, well, I guess they don't dismiss them so much. And even Trump sometimes, if it supports his point, he will link to like a New York Times story in his Truth Social feed, if it supports what he's saying. Now, on the other hand, of course, no surprise, he would, if it's negative to him, he would label it fake news.
Right.
But it's so, I mean, it's so disturbing that you take this entire this industry that is an essential pillar of our democracy, journalism, and Trump, in two words, just makes it crumble. And those two words, of course, are fake news. That's what anything that gets published that he doesn't like, it's fake news. And it's like, oh my God. And it works. It works for his base.
The broad point there is fascinating to me. All right. That it seems that even in, and even from Donald Trump himself, that there is sort of like this backstop of, whatever we define mainstream press as, that is the source of most of our information, whether it is the Times or the Associated Press or the Washington Post. These sort of NBC, ABC, these massive outlets are sort of this backbone that no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you are sort of depending on.
Right.
With that being said, how and you hinted at this earlier, that that right-wing media sources tend to see all those places that I mentioned, especially the New York Times, as left-wing media.
Right.
You also mentioned that you tried the lefting, which is fascinating. In fact, I encourage you, do that. I know it seems shallow now, but I encourage you to go back to that project.
All
How do
right.
you define left-wing media?
Well, so I'm a child of the '60s. So to me, left-wing media was the media I grew up with at the time, which came into being because essentially of the anti-war movement and the civil rights era. You know, those two big um, uh, events, and it really drove a different type of media. And it also came about with the advent of FM radio, which was really kind of album oriented rock, and so that was, absolutely left wing. So I'm talking about the Village Voice, the East Village, every major metropolitan um, market in the United States had at least one alternative weekly, and possibly more. And college campuses, most of the students' newspapers were very progressive. So to me, that's what I think of when I think of progressive progressive media. Now it's probably, it's a handful. It's places like The Nation, Mother Jones, Slate, Salon, fit in those categories. The New Republic. So that's what I think of. But it's not nearly as diverse and strong as it was, back in the '60s, early '70s, when so much of it was all about, the anti-war movement. You would go to a left wing newspaper because they may have advice on how to avoid the draft, or if you're if you're uh, fleeing the country and moving to Canada, they'll have the names of organizations that will help you, and then there might be a full page ad for a big anti-war demonstration in Washington taking place in 2 weeks. And so those are the things that when I think of progressive media, that's what it is.
Tell me about the gulf in between. Obviously, as you laid out earlier, you sort of you come from this sort of mainstreamish, you know, perspective, right?
Right.
And you cover right-wing media, and your perspective of what that liberal media is it's so different than what the perspective of the sources in the writing are.
Right.
Um, what's in between there?
You mean that what types of media or what happened
Yeah,
at?
what's in between there?
Yeah. Again, so like, listen, we could debate for hours. Like, is the New York Times progressive or mainstream? And are we talking about its news pages or its editorial pages? I think its editorial pages, to me, lean more to the left. There are some right wing voices in there, and gives it some good balance. By if the New York Times calls Trump a liar and says that Trump lost the election, does that make the New York Times a progressive media outlet? I think no, but again, people on the right would say, "Oh my God, that's they're a progressive news organization." I watch, I watch network news from a few times a week, and it seems like the coverage is right down the middle of the plate, and very balanced. It's a good summation, but I, I do not think that a lot of right wing politicians feel the same way, even though they'd want to be on the Sunday public affairs shows and things like that. They're trying to reach their audience, and right now that's fragmenting. I think a lot of politicians are reaching out to people like you to podcast. I think as the market fragments, they're trying to reach people in many different ways. But James, just as my point, in my work, I do some reporting on some of the right wing outlets, and some of the places will not speak to me because they say, quote, "Howard, you're the enemy," unquote.
Hmm.
They distrust me. Now I also would say, I have to add that a few places seek me out and invite me over and say, and which is great. And I, all the conversations I have with places like that, I always start saying like, um, we're probably going to disagree on politics, like over 90% of the stuff, but I hope. But can we talk? Can you explain your point of view to me? And I'd listen, and I don't say, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Like you're crazy. I try and listen to it, and I must say, I think, and I read a lot. I try and stay up on a lot of stuff. I would say that 3/4 of them could win a debate against me. You know, I,
Hmm.
I'm I'm impressed by the scope of the knowledge and how deeply they go into it. So it's not all bad. I'll tell you one time. One time I said on a radio show, I said my job every morning is to parachute behind enemy lines to find out what the right is thinking. And I got an email from a listener who really took a great offense on that. And that listener, he was on the right, but he did say like, "Why do you call us the enemy?" And it was like, and he had a point. Like I shouldn't. I thought I was being clever. I think it was a clever thing to say, but in a way, I shouldn't think of them as the enemy. I mean, some of the thinking to me feels like the enemy of democracy, but I think it's just a little too harsh and builds too much of a barrier between me and right wing media to label, you know, every media outlet that I don't agree with because it's on the right as, in enemy territory. I do not think that's right. And, that person helped change my thinking a bit.
Yeah, I would think that would certainly like cause a tension
Right.
beyond sort of like your larger goal.
Right. And just so you know, my what I try and do is not antagonize the right. I mean, that's low hanging fruit. It's too easy to make fun of it and stuff. It's I like to um, look at it as even handed as possible. Just try and get the facts. Just try and understand what's going on. Understand some of the business structures of some of these websites, how they go about their business, how they make money, how they reach their audience. Just get the information because most journalists either most mainstream news organizations, they don't have the staff to investigate it, or those that may be inclined, they may be dismissive, or they may bring it, be biased against it, or they may do it only if they hold their nose. What I like to say, it's like, to me, it's like does a scientist looking at a new virus, does a scientist not look at the virus under a microscope because he or she is repulsed by it? No, you look at the virus because you want to understand it and how it behaves, and how that might be, a threat to you or a benefit to you.
You kind of cross back to some in fact, I'd like to sort of restate something I mentioned a bit earlier, because your response there kind of ties back to what I was getting at. You mentioned fragmentation, and this fragmentation has created opportunities for massive opportunities for right wing organizations, or conservative, or depending on which what moniker they're under, or perspective, to sprout up and to be massively successful. Why do you why do you not see a similar crop pop up on the left? Do they feel served already, or no? Or is it just like something that's just not done yet?
Well, I think there are some places that are doing it, but I don't think it's as widespread as the right. I mean, so for instance, I think a very successful podcast is obviously Pod Save America.
Mhm.
That's geared for progressive audiences. So there are those. I'm seeing a little bit more on with podcasts, but certainly, right wing radio is completely dominated by conservatives.
Mhm.
The to me the only it's just very tiny number of progressive radio talk shows, and Thomas Hartman's probably the leading progressive talk show. So yeah, and why does that happen? I'm not entirely sure. Partly, I think that a lot of it is the information flow is served by mainstream media. Like, so if you're progressive, you feel you know enough by listening, by reading, or consuming mainstream media. And you may have the New York Times, you watch CBS, you'll watch CNN or MSNBC, you read a magazine or so, and you go to a few websites, and you'll be informed. And even if you're very liberal, that may be enough.
Earlier, you mentioned that doing this kind of work made you a better listener.
Right.
Why?
Because when I the one or two times a month where I engage with right wing publishers or right wing journalists, I there's a part of me in another time in my life, if someone said something what I hear coming from the right, a lot of times I would have jumped down their throat and been combative and or dismissive. But now I hold my tongue, and I try and listen, and I try and figure out where they're coming from, and um, and try and deal with it in a more diplomatic way. And I think it's smart. I mean, I think generally a lesson in life is to listen more, talk less. As said Howard Polskin as he's talking on a podcast. So I'm getting a week's worth of talking in right now, and you're a good listener.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And for those who are listening, there's a method to my madness. I tend to, especially when I'm doing an interview, talk as little as possible. Try to listen. When I see the edited version of this, I want to see my guests be 2/3 of the conversation or more. I want to hear what you think in your perspective. And I that leads me to something broadly as sort of as a I guess I could put you in any number of categories, right? I can call you a media journalist, a media critic. How well are we listening to each other? Do we listen to each other?
You mean Howard and James or people to people?
I mean, people to people and people in the world that you cover.
Um, I don't think we listen enough. For instance, and I'm going to wade into this, and I may be leading with my chin. Let's take a big issue on the right, and that's abortion. Um, I listen. I believe in a woman's right to choose, but when I hear people are on the right because of the abortion issue, like I understand it. It's not how I feel, but I don't view them as crazy for thinking that way. I understand it. Now, when it comes to January 6th and what took place at the Capitol, that to me was like, no, there's no two sides. I have a really hard time seeing that in any other way. When we look at the results of the 2020 election, that to me is like, no, it's like it's like Trump lost. So I'm not really interested in hearing another point of view on that. Some issues I try and listen more. So for instance, I listen a lot more on the uh, 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 on the issue of transgender rights and everything related to that, because I understand, and again, it's not my belief, but I understand where this might be unsettling to some people. Um, so I, I listen carefully to those issues, and that's why I think what happened with Dylan Mulvaney and the whole Bud Light fiasco. I mean, that was a real turning point, and I think it behooves mainstreamers and progressives to examine that reaction carefully, because there's something underneath it.
Speaking of another party that I think should be examining incidents like that tightly, how do you grade our level of reporting on media in America broadly? Who's doing a good job at it besides yourself? And who was your competition?
Um, well, I love media criticism, and I follow it very very closely. Uh, I was before Brian Stelter left CNN. I was a huge fan of his. I love the work that Oliver Darcy and his editor are doing at CNN Reliable Sources. I think that the New York Times, Washington Post are doing great work. The newsletter Puck is doing great work. The media reporter Claire Atkinson is out on her own with a Substack doing some groundbreaking work. Um, so the work coming out of Pointer, Dave Bauder at AP. I'm just kind of scratching the surface, and I know listen, I was a huge fan of the late great David Carr, the New York Times. Um, I, I know I'm probably missing some folks, but that's a good start. It's not quite as vibrant as it used to be, and I'm sorry, I should mention the Columbia Journalism Review, and I believe I mentioned Pointer. It's not it's not quite as vibrant as it used to be, but there's still a lot of media criticism going on. And again, I am a judge. Every year the new house school at Syracuse has the Mirror Awards, and I've been a judge on those awards for over a dozen years. So I see some of the best media criticism coming out of our nation's journalists, and it's really great work.
but also not as vibrant as it used to be. What
There's
happened?
a few places. What happened? I would think it probably some of it was coming from alternative weeklies, like you might get the Village Voice would have a press critic, um, and it just has to do with the fragmentation of media, and so the beat has just kind of gotten there aren't quite as many people in it as used to be, and I don't have any numbers to go against it. It just feels that way to me.
I would argue, you know, um, shrinking newsrooms probably play a role, I would imagine. Other fragmentation, I would think, as well.
Yep, yep.
Do you do you think media coverage of right-wing media is fair?
Um, yes, yes. So what I read is I think is pretty even-handed. Yes, yeah. It's not like I look at it and go like, "Wow, that was pretty mean. That was pretty gratuitous." You'll see more snarky stuff on Twitter. People will say stuff or in social media. But as far as most mainstream news outlets, I would say they're pretty even-handed. Yeah. I wrote
And
something in 2018. I wrote something. I'm not going to say where it was for or anything like that, but my God, was I snarky? I was mean. I was mean. I was being thought I was being clever and stuff like that. And the people on the right that I was writing about, they were very upset with it. They were very upset, and I thought like, um, I need to be more even-handed. I think I stepped over the line on that. But, that was the last time I did that. But a lot of times I think it's low-hanging fruit, to be snarky toward it. I sometimes let my snark out every newsletter. I haven't my newsletter comes out every morning about 11 o'clock, and I always write a 200-word introduction to it, and that's where I let my snark out. Sometimes I really point out something that I think is just stupid or ridiculous. Um, and like, or I'll pick out something like Ivanka Trump, is I bet you didn't know this. Ivanka Trump is taking helicopter lessons. And then
no.
yes. Oh, and then I wrote, this didn't I wrote, that's probably to help daddy make a quick getaway after he's convicted. And then I just X'd out that last part. Like, don't put that, so
Um, man, there are so many other places I wanted to go. I want to go with you. You've mentioned podcasting earlier, and you've mentioned social media. Do tracking those areas does that make your job harder?
yes, the more the more places where right wing opinion lives, the more platforms that it lives. It's like another thing I've got to monitor, and I can't be everywhere at once. I mean, first of all, when you think of right wing media, you know the 8,000-pound gorilla, of course, is Fox News. Then there's FoxNews.com. Well, then you also have Fox Business News. Then you have Newsmax TV. Then you have, Right Side Broadcasting Network. Then you have OAN. And these are just some television outlets. And then you've got you think of there must be at least 50 to 60 right wing podcasts out there. who's monitoring that? You've got right-wing book publishing. You've got right-wing children's book publishing. Um, so you're all over the map on this. So, and all of this content is reaching millions of people a day and influencing how they're thinking and how they're voting.
Like most media, you've explained they're a complicated mishmash.
Right.
I'd like to go into some of the, the characters into companies and in this complicated mishmash.
Sure.
Um, you mentioned MAGA media.
Right.
Every time I hear someone say MAGA media, I think of Jake Tapper. Uh, um, w- in MAGA media, who stands out in you in that world, and how do you define how would you define that kind of world?
Well, I mean, to me, it's basically right-wing media. Not
All of
conservative.
right wing media is MAGA media.
Yeah, I mean, there's conservative media and then there's right-wing media. So,
Where's the
right-wing media, I define as, to the right of conservative media.
okay?
Um, so, and I kind of, I started out calling it all conservative media, but then I was like, no, that's like, the National Review is conservative media. I would not say that it's, it, you're not wrong to call it right-wing media, but it's more accurate to call it conservative media. So these distinctions. I'm lucky I don't have a have a lot of people I work with because we spend hours debating it and never get anywhere on this. So I generally call it right-wing media. But some of the big players in right-wing media. Um, I certainly think it's been covered to some extent, is the Daily Wire.
Mhm.
I mean, that is a huge place. So Ben Shapiro is the force behind it. Ben Shapiro is so first of all, he's got a podcast. So every quarter I track the number of subscribers to the top 20 right-wing podcasts. And I just do it on this one platform, Castbox. Are you familiar with Castbox,
Yeah.
James?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Castbox has just under 2% of the podcast audience. So Castbox gives me the number of subscribers that he has. So he has 500,000 subscribers to his podcast on Castbox. So if you multiply that by 20, because I'm sorry, not by 20. If you do that by 50, uh, you will get 25 million subscribers he has. That's like network. That's a huge audience. Now
Yeah.
that's not listening to every podcast he has,
Of course.
but it
It's
certainly shows like that's his overall footprint. And even if he's getting 10% of that, so that's 2.5 million subscribers listening at any time. That's a great audience. That's how you build a business. Now, it's not surprising, therefore, he's got his website, the Daily Wire, he's got his podcast, he's got several other podcasts in his network.
mhm.
So it's not surprising that he's now producing feature-length films and he's
Mhm.
able to promote it to his audience. So that's just one place. And what a smart play that is. So what else? What other places
Yeah.
do you
I
wanna know?
I have a yeah, and, on top of that, I believe he also has a radio show,
Yeah.
and I think he has a column as well. I knew he did at one point. I'm not sure
Yeah,
if he
he's
still does.
syndicated column and stuff like that. He's you know,
Yeah.
he's multi-platform, he's all over the place, he's very strategic, and, my guess is, they're making a lot of money. There's a lot of money coming in there, and, he's positioned to be a very big player in right-wing media.
Okay. I have a few other names I'd like to run
Right.
through. Tim Pool. What do you make of him?
Not that familiar with him.
I think it's a rabbit hole you should go down.
Uh-oh. All right.
He's mostly podcasting and YouTube. He's giant on YouTube, has multiple
Really?
YouTube channels that are over 1 million. And he is sort of, I would call him a mini Daily Wire.
Wow. Tim
So
Pool. With an E at the end, right? So with an E at the end.
no,
No?
no, no.
Pool.
Yeah, yeah. Well worth.
All
It's
right.
very interesting. I mean, he has a daily show that goes live at 8 p.m. and gets at times 80,000 live concurrent
Wow.
watchers on YouTube. Massive guy. The
All right.
Daily Caller. What do you make of them?
Wait, say again?
The Daily Caller. What do you make of them?
I think the site bores me a little bit. It, I mean,
Why?
their story selection, the layout. It's just the headlines are a little cumbersome. It just feels like I entered a time tunnel and it's 2008 all over again.
Wow.
But they, I respect them, and they're serious about what they're doing. It's just that the site doesn't excite me as much. Whereas when I look at something like WND, I mean,
Hmm.
I'm always eager to go there every morning to think like, how are they going to offend me today? What are they going to be? What are they going to be posting that is going to upset me or just go, what are they thinking? That is so off the wall. So, some places I eagerly I look forward to it. I'll tell you that the person there's two people I want to mention on the right, so one is they're two columnists. One is a columnist for the town hall. His name is Kurt Schlichter,
Okay.
and he is he's an LA attorney slash comedian slash veteran of the Iraqi war. And he's a flamethrower, and he's very caustic, in almost a scary manner. But he's an incredible wordsmith, and
Hmm.
as much as I disagree with almost everything that he writes, he makes me laugh, and I'm like, wow, that guy is so talented. So that's that's, and he writes about 3 times a week. And the other guy is Steve Cruiser with a K, who's also a comedian who writes a daily column called The Morning Briefing for PJ Media, and he's also very funny and very caustic and very offensive. But you read him because it's like he amuses you. And that said, there's nothing that's ever made me laugh on the Daily Caller.
Wow.
So I need my humor. Yes.
Well, One Not Dating was next on my list. What do you make of Steve Bannon?
Here's the most important thing I can say. He's got the best hair in right-wing media. Like, that guy's hair is amazing. And if you look at pictures of him 30 years ago, like, he was a handsome dude, like that guy. So, and he's an evil genius. He scares me, but I lose sleep, wondering, what he's up to and what he's plotting. I just wish he'd get out of politics and just go and just market hair care products. I'd sleep a lot better.
Glenn Beck in The Blaze.
Oh, I the site, confuses me. There's rarely anything that I find worthwhile when I go on the site. That said, just 2 days ago, they made 2 purchases, 2 companies, more like lifestyle products. I haven't figured out what's behind that, but in my world, I don't see them as a big influence. And I also, some of the ways I look at it is, what is Trump linking to? And I
Mm.
don't see them linked to the Blaze that much. Where Trump might link to the Gateway Pundit or the Daily Caller, the Federalist, obviously Fox News, Newsmax, places like that.
The Federalist was on my list. So
Mm.
what's your perspective on them?
Um, the the Federalists. I mean, listen, I give them credit. It looks like to me they always have 4 new pieces of content every day, um, and it's like they're doing a pretty good job. They're not sending out reporters. They're just doing opinion pieces. They have a point of view. Molly Hemingway there is the big name writer, and when she's got a piece in there, I always try and read it.
Clay Travis and Outkick.
um, yeah, I think they're doing a good job. The danger when I go on Outkick, and this is when you know that a website is doing a good job, because you're trying to. I'm trying to to get through to do the newsletter in under 2 hours every morning. But when I go on Outkick, I start reading everything. It's a very well done site. The headlines are good. They really they have a good story selection, and then their point of view. They, their political point of view sneaks through in a few places, but most of the time it's covered under all this sports news. And I'm a big sports fan, so it's very dangerous for me to go on that site.
You mentioned these folks before, Newsmax.
Newsmax. I think you could be someone if you just read Newsmax every morning and not anything else. You might be, um, reasonably informed. I mean, they
Okay.
will, um, you know, uh, it's like they're always, a lot of times it feels like Alan Dershowitz is quoted every day in there. Um, but I think and actually they have a liberal columnist, Susan Estrich. I give them credit for that. She's got a weekly column and the opinion pages. That's pretty good. And they try and stay on top of the news and do a good job on
Tucker Carlson.
that. Well, so Tucker is a brilliant broadcaster. I tried not to when he was on Fox. I really didn't want to watch the show. It's disturbing to me. It's easier for me to read this stuff than to watch it on TV. So, but Tucker is a brilliant communicator, and when you listen to him, it's easy to get your mind polluted. He's very compelling. He tells a good story, and then you're like, wait a minute, whoa, 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 that is so wrong, and but he's done a he's done a great job, creating a brand for himself. But his popularity is enormously disturbing to me. I disagree with almost everything that he says. Now, I would say that to Tucker Carlson's credit, I believe in March of 2020, he went down to Mar-a-Lago and tried to convince Trump about the dangers of the pandemic. And so like he was ahead of a lot of right-wing media on that. I don't know what he subsequently said in other shows, but I do know that happened.
there were a couple of places that I wanted to mention that I wasn't sure if they quite fit. So I want to ask you where these people fit in the ecosystem, or places like the Wall Street Journal.
Um, so the Wall Street Journal's editorial pages are very right wing, and they are really down on climate. They think they're down on climate change. They really don't come out as believers in it, and they're critical of people who are believers in climate change. And a lot of times that really riles when I have headlines from the Wall Street Journal. It really upsets my readers. I would also say that one of the things that I really have a hard time with the Journal, when they in June of 2020 they ran a an opinion piece by then my Vice President Mike Pence, basically saying that the pandemic was over, I believe, and it was like so irresponsible. And you get why they were doing it, because it was really bolstering the Republican administration at the time. But that was very, to me, very irresponsible and highly offensive to me.
David French.
I like his stuff a lot. I'm a fan. Yeah,
Wow,
yeah,
that was a quick one.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Um, and we've mentioned Fox News several times, but is the big enchilada. So I figure on this list I wanted to end with them, and we mentioned, obviously News Corp also owns Outkick and Wall Street Journal, and until
New
recently
York
Tucker
Post.
Carlson was
Yeah.
there, New York Post as well. But it seems to me that Fox is in a very difficult place right now. With the loss of Tucker Carlson, and it seems like they're kind of in an identity crisis, as you sort of mentioned earlier. Most of this right wing media world, is MAGA land, and from the headlines that I've seen and the stories I've seen from right wing land, they're kind of now bucking on Fox as well. Do you see that as well? Or am I imagining things?
Wait. I'm sorry. That MAGA land is down on Fox.
Yes, yes.
Yes, I mean I've seen it. Um, uh, let's see if I believe it. Let's see how long that lasts. I mean,
Hmm.
it's kind of been fashionable, but I still kind of think they're GOP kingmakers. Are really they're highly influential. Their audience is just so vast. It's just can't escape them. You know, I mean, I'm on I'm I was flying from Florida to New York yesterday, and watching live TV on the entertainment system, and so you have like 6 channels to choose from, and you got CNN, MSNBC, and the third is Fox, and that's so they're everywhere, and you go to a gym, and you may have 6 channels to choose from, and one might be Fox. So they have tremendous distribution. They're all over the place, very slickly produced, and I think it would be a mistake to count them out. And yeah, they've been dinged. There's no question about it. Um, but I would not count them out at all. And their website, just so you know, their website is on a tear. Has been growing its audience for the last 7 months, and it's very
Wow.
impressive. They revamped their website. They've done a really good job, and and that is a huge that is a huge website. It's almost as big as it reaches almost as many people as the New York Times.com.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a sub question there. In that, is all right. So it's Fox. Just, it's such a behemoth. It's inescapable. Is the sort of upset in like these other places? you know, whether it's Daily Wire or Blaze or wherever, is that a passing shower, or is it self-interest? Like, what do you think that
Well,
that
some of it has to do with just the fragmentation of the media of the entire media environment. You know, all the behemoths are getting smaller. You know, whether it's, you know, the three broadcast networks, all the cable networks, you know, because of streaming, you know, that has fragmented audiences. So when people are cutting the cord, they're not, you know, they may not be getting Fox News anymore. You know, we certainly see where ESPN, for instance, has, you know, 10 years ago and had reached 100 million households. It's now down to 70 million. So the cable networks are in the same boat. You know, and that's why I mentioned that, you know, Fox News has has done a good job on its website. They've got Fox Nation, a streaming play. I think that's probably, you know, pretty small and inconsequential, and it's hard to know whether that's going to be a big player or not. You know, it certainly makes one wonder. But there's certainly a lot of options out there. That's for sure.
On that note, Howard Polskin, any famous last words?
Keep your mind open, your mouth closed, and listen as much as possible.
I would love to have you back. That is fascinating stuff
You've been
here.
great. Thank you.